chances are you'll probably find a lot of RX 5700 XT in your local market. You'll find this in eBay, your Facebook Marketplace, or even AliExpress. There's heaps of this card. So the question would be, in 2024, is the RX 5700 XT worth it? And to do that, we're not going to be running this card in like the standard AAA games because you'll find a lot of that on other channels. What we're going to focus on is on those fast-paced multiplayer shooters wherein speed and stability is really essential for your gaming experience. And on the later part of the video, we're also going to look at the RX 5700 XT and compare this against possibly a good alternative in the current landscape, which is the RX 6600. Okay, let's go. What we have here is the SOYO RX 5700 XT, which we got from AliExpress. This is a pretty standard card. It's not the best card out there, but it does the job. We're going to put this on our Ryzen 5800 X3D, paired with 32 gigabytes of 3600 megahertz RAM. We've installed the latest drivers, and Windows has been updated for this testing. And on our testing, we have run the games multiple times before we started recording. And because we are testing mostly competitive games, we're also going to be using real-world competitive settings because we play the frag not for fidelity. Okay, let's start with our first game, Warzone. Here we have the native 1080p run of the RX 5700 XT. This benchmark run was taken on a standard plunder mode where there's a lot of people on the map. It looks pretty good here. Our FPS is reaching about 150. GPU power is reaching the maximum 150 watts. GPU is maxed out. Frame times is pretty okay too, with 1% lows around 100. Let's have a look at how it runs against 1440p with quality FSR turned on. FPS has dropped a bit with 1% lows still remaining roughly the same. I've added a custom fan curve here with the 1440p mode as I noticed it was getting a bit hot on the 1080p run with our SOYO card. Firing shots seems to be okay for both modes, although if you want to max out your FPS, 1080p native is the way to go. And for those who are curious, here's how the 1080p with FSR tray turned on looks like. Obviously, we wouldn't be using this as it's not the best in terms of video quality. You'd really struggle with long-range visibility in this one. Jumping now to an actual Battle Royale game, and this just confirms our benchmark run here. Getting roughly 150 FPS still, with lows a bit lower because we are now moving into a lot of scenarios on heavy action scenes. There are some micro stutters on our frame times, but this is pretty much negligible. We're still able to hit our shots. This is a good experience. AMD has stabilized their drivers for Warzone, and this is quite good. Let's move on to another fast-paced shooter, Apex Legends, and this one's pretty good too. We're getting around 240, 250 FPS when there's nothing going on. We do get some frame time spikes at times, but this is mostly related to the server, especially at the start of the game. In Apex Legends, we didn't maxed out our RX 5700 XT. Our power is still pushing 150 watts. Even with smokes, I'd still say this is a pretty good experience for competitive 1080p gaming. Let's move on to another game which is fast-paced, and this is Fortnite. We're running performance mode API because that's how you would play competitively in this game. We are clearly CPU bottleneck here as we haven't maxed out our GPU. It's easy to achieve really high FPS in Fortnite with performance mode going around 400 and sometimes 500 FPS. Frame times is mostly stable, apart from some stuttering when we go through the map. And since this season is mostly a vehicle warfare, we're just mostly running around fragging people with our grenade launchers. GPU usage is at 80%, and this is a pretty decent experience. Clock speed seems to be stable too on our RX 5700 XT. I feel like I didn't need to tweak it here as it's mostly at the higher end. The base clock for the RX 5700 XT is at 1600 megahertz. In here, we're pushing towards the boost number. And for those who are curious, here's a look at all three APIs with our RX 5700 XT, DX11, DX12, and performance mode. And before we proceed, boys, if you have found our testing helpful, can you do us a favor and smash that like button? Helldivers 2 is another DX12 title which does utilize a lot of our GPU resources. Here we have the benchmark run of our RX 5700 XT on medium settings. And here's how it runs against low settings. Low settings definitely brings out a whole lot of FPS with our RX 5700 XT. However, it's also pretty obvious that the difference in terms of fidelity is like night and day. So for in-game testing, we'll just have to stay with medium settings because this is a PvE game. So yeah, at Helldive difficulty, you can see that we are just barely over 60 FPS. We've maxed out our RX 5700 XT. There's a lot of terminated bugs, there's a lot of explosions, and there's a lot of things happening here. But what I do like about this game is that it's so stable. We're getting a really tight number here on our average FPS and even on our lows. Look at that frame time graph. It's so stable. Clock speeds are pushing beyond 1800 megahertz, and this is a pretty good experience for you Helldivers out there. Let's go back now to our competitive games, and here we have Valorant. Now, this game doesn't require much GPU resource, so this is pretty easy for our RX 5700 XT. Just utilizing around 60% of our GPU, and the clock speeds is just roughly at 1300 megahertz. So here on the new map, Abyss, we are getting a pretty high FPS at around 500. Frame times do have some stuttering in the first couple of rounds, but yeah, this is pretty normal for Valorant. This stabilizes, on third or fourth round. So no complaints there. You can game competitively with the RX 5700 XT and Valorant if that's all you get. Another GPU heavy game that we are testing is PUBG. This is running under DX11 Enhanced API, which pushes our RX 5700 XT really hard. We have maxed out our GPU here, and clock speeds are pushing really high as well. FPS is around 160, frame times is mostly stable, but we do get those random stutters in the game, but this is expected with PUBG. It's something about going through the map and textures and assets are loading. It is annoying when it happens, however, this is tolerable. I would ignore the 0.1% lows in this scenario. Totally fine, like gameplay's fine. Right, here we have the RX 5700 XT compared against the RX 6600. Let's start with Warzone 1080p, no upscaling, just raw native. And here we can see that both cards are actually pretty close. Even on our firing shots, they are relatively the same. The main difference here is just the power consumption. I haven't set the fan curve here for our RX 6600, so you'll probably see that it will run a bit higher on its temperatures throughout these days. Let's move on to Helldivers 2, and RX 5700 XT edges out slightly here. Still the same power consumption issues, and both cards are maxed out in this DX12 title. Moving on to Valorant, and here we can see that they are still really close to each other. The RX 5700 XT does seem to be slightly leading here in our running benchmark, with some slight changes on our grenade benchmark. Next up is Fortnite, and this one continues with a trend. The RX 5700 XT pulls slightly ahead here over the RX 6600, but both cards are still pulling strong moves here on the performance mode API. PUBG really pushes our graphics with a DX11 Enhanced API, and both cards remain highly utilized in this game. The RX 5700 XT still continues to lead here, but it's a very negligible lead. You can actually go either way between these cards. I'd say if power is not a big deal for you, then price will be the main factor. Which of these cards would you pick? The RX 5700 XT does perform slightly better over the slightly newer RX 6600 at the cost of 50% more power. We're using a base model here for both our cards, and our SOYO RX 5700 XT definitely performs as expected. Speaking of SOYO, we've also tested a much cheaper SOYO card a few weeks ago, and that one was quite surprising. If you want to see that, click this video right here, and we'll see you guys over there.